I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I'll do it now. Is it off? Yeah. Can you see the screen, Rachel? Yeah. Hi, that. Yeah. Perfect. I'll have it here.
Right. Welcome back, everyone. Afternoon session. We're moving away a little bit from focusing on hate crime perpetrators and looking a little bit at the responses to hate crime in the next 4 presentations. Like with the morning session, we'll have 15-minute presentations, questions. So do pop them in the chat if you're online, or make a note of whatever you want to ask our panelists later on. And just for all of the speakers, I'll be showing you these cards as 1 minute, 5, 2 and 1 minute reminders, just so that you can, wrap up your ideas and hopefully stick to time. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the session, and good luck to all of our speakers.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Loretta Trickett. I'm a professor here at Nottingham University in criminology and criminal justice. I want to talk to you about a couple of projects that I've been involved in, which are focused on hate crime risk assessment, which I developed with 2 police forces, the second one with Different Powers Police. I want to focus on this because I'm going to include a police perspective here on whether or not they found risk assessment helpful in improving service to hate crime victims. And within the theme of this conference being perpetrators, really thinking about the victim's perception of the perpetration and what they needed, rather than a focus on the perpetrator. Okay, so as I said, I was involved with Nottinghamshire Police in the development of a hate crime risk assessment model in 2016. This came about as a result of me having quite a lot of involvement with Nottingham Hate Crime Steering Group, and we heard a lot of research which criticising the police, saying, oh, people aren't satisfied, don't report to police, under reporting of hate crime, don't need to tell you all that, most of you in the room will know about that, and people lack faith in reporting hate crime to the police, and when they do that, they're dissatisfied. I'll come back to that in a moment. What I want to do is look at policing perspective on this, to say, well, actually, looking at training for police on hate crime, what were the barriers for them, and what maybe were some of the tools that might hence the focus of the study. If you want to look at this in more detail, this is included in a study called The Policing of Hate Crime in Nottinghamshire, which is available to download on Google Scholar. And as a result of that, I was asked to then help Different Powers to develop a risk assessment model for their region. Again, if you want to read a little bit more about this, there are a couple of relevant articles, because obviously I can't refer to it all today. So there's a couple of articles which are on the slide if you're interested in reading a bit more detail. Okay, so obviously we know that the law recognises currently 5 types of hate crime. And we also know about the legislation that's covered under, and that there is a possibility, obviously, sometimes for an uplift tariff. And the police and the CPS work on the basis of a criminal offence perceived by the victim or other person to be motivated by hostility or prejudice around the protected characteristics. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that because you'll be familiar with it. Okay, but what are persistent issues for policing are issues around underreporting of hate crime, secondary victimisation, this dissatisfaction and distrust in policing. And the Crime Survey for England and Wales has repeatedly over the years come up with findings that say that victims of hate crime are more likely to be unsatisfied with responses from police, are more likely to believe that they weren't dealt with fairly or treated with respect. So, it is an issue for policing, despite the fact that there have been many policing initiatives to try to address this and to improve hate crime service. As part of this, the College of Policing issued guidance in 2020, updated 2022, looking at how police should respond to hate crime victims. And we can see here that what they talked about was identifying and bringing offenders to justice, but also 2 key things really for risk assessment: signing victims to appropriate support, and also trying to reduce repeat victimisation, which is obviously where hate crime is focused. And here, I'm not going to go into all of this, you can read this in your own time, but it talks about, you know, why risk assessment is needed around hate crime. This is because, as we know, victims are targeted on the basis of their identities. So it is considered to be a more serious crime for that reason. It has wider impacts outside of that for communities from which victims are drawn. Sometimes as well, risk assessment is needed because of issues related to the victim. So the victim might be particularly isolated. There might be something going on that makes that victim, you know, particularly vulnerable in that moment in time. And then there might be other risk factors that are to do sometimes also with politics, you know, media coverage, etc., etc. So it is quite a complex picture. And we wanted to design a risk assessment that could capture all of those facets of different risk for people. And so really the risk assessment is trying to contextualise the risk around the direct victim, around their personal history, their identity and the impact on them, and any issues that might be going on that make that worse for them. The impact of local, national and international events, and the potential for escalation and accumulation. We do know, of course, sometimes that hate crimes will just happen and they'll be very severe. You know, it might be a one-off, but often they are repeated. So some case studies here that we might be familiar with would be Fiona Pilkington, locally down the road in Leicestershire, Bijan Ebrahimi, and the last one is a case study here, Mohammed Salim from my own home city of Birmingham, who was murdered on the way to prayers on a Friday in about 2:13, I think that case was. And that was a case where, you know, somebody was directly targeted and then that murder just happened, you know. Obviously didn't happen at the blue with the perpetrator, that's for the people to talk about, but it did in relation to the victim. Okay, so what we want to learn about, we've, having done some writing about this and looked at these two examples, and I've published with Tim Bryan, who's a Canadian scholar, on this, is it's really important for police to recognise hate crime and label it properly when it happens. Sometimes in the past, officers have failed to recognise a hate crime and understood the series around that, because sometimes, you know, in the past it's been thought that they mirror antisocial behaviour. We know it's very different, but in the past sometimes, you know, you might have one example where it's not considered that serious. You've got to think about the fact that police are going out on response, they're dealing with a massive volume of crimes, and sometimes, you know, what might appear to be a problem with neighbours or something that's happened on the internet, particularly where it's an incident, might not seem that important, but obviously it is. And so what we're trying to look at here is to capture the significance for the victim and to prevent any escalation or future victimisation and to safeguard. And actually, although we've done quite a lot in this country on hate crime in recent years, it's still really in its infancy, I think, globally, and there's a lot more that could be done with it. So I helped Nottinghamshire Police develop this risk assessment, and it asked 27 questions of victims, and they were divided into 4 areas, which were based on information about the incident, that they knew, where they did know about the perpetrator, questions about previous victimisation, and information about impact. We also asked what were the risks for Notts Police in getting things wrong, because the risks for the police are very significant in getting hate crime wrong. And indeed, the HMIC FRS report in 2018 spelled that out. So one of the things we wanted to look at was trust, lack of trust in Notts Police if you don't get hate crime right. I'm not going to go into massive detail about the Nottinghamshire model, because you can read all about it in those other publications I've mentioned. I'm going to move on to talk a little bit more now about the example from Diffin and Paris. So Nottingham is a very diverse city. We are a very diverse university. You can read about that in my report, you know, what was found out there. Diffin and Paris is a very different force. It's in South Wales, much less diverse. The sorts of hate crimes that were going on there at the time that I helped them to build this risk assessment model were that they'd had an asylum centre developed there. There was a lot of hostility around that, a lot of hostility at different times in the year about holiday makers, incomers, neighbourhood disputes around that, quite a lot of homophobia. was also evident there. And then other examples were around trans issues, particularly in schools, and around anti-trans sentiments. And a lot of these things were online as well as in person. So what I did was I did some research with the force with 42 officers, and they answered a survey on the development of the risk assessment and also the focus groups, and that's what I'm going to talk about in the time I've got. In relation to that, we developed, first of all, a risk assessment model, and then we trialed it. I'm not going to go into the methodology here. Obviously, we got ethical approval. It's all in the publications that I've mentioned, in the articles. You can read about that. But the officers asked a survey on the development of the risk assessment, and then what we did is we fine-tuned it because we used their answers to improve it. So they took part in the survey and then subsequent focus groups. What we found overall was that the officers found the risk assessment to be beneficial. Now, initially, when risk assessment is introduced, officers can think more paperwork to fill in. They have a lot of paperwork to fill in. Some of them originally, when risk assessment was introduced, saw it as just another thing for them to have to do. And that meant also that hate crimes are taking longer to process because you have to fill in the paperwork. But actually, over time, as they embed, they start to see the benefits. So we can see here from the survey, some of the responses say it can focus the mind and ensure the correct level of response if the officer follows the risk assessment. It provides evidence on the crime and the grading. Useful to have a scoring system and a better breakdown of the risks. So what it's saying is it's providing like a blueprint. I'm not going to read all of these, you can read them in your own time, but what they were basically saying was it enables you to develop a more sympathetic response to the victim because you're getting more of the detail from the victim, and you're finding out about how it's made them feel in more detail, a lot more detail, because the questions are giving you a framework to ask that. And that means that you can put in place more support, offer more empathetic solutions. It enables you to give a more tailored response to that victim. We can see here it enables you to be more sensitive because you get a better grounding of that particular victim. So it's enabling you to show more kind of empathy. And these were echoed in the focus groups that we did. So we can see here that officers recognise the need for risk assessment, saying that they understood that, you know, hate crime, there could be wider ramifications. If you're talking about a race incident, obviously that there are wider things for that individual victim connected to their history and their history of discrimination, but also for communities. So what it says is you can start to understand the ripple effects because of the risk assessment. Also enables officers, this is a real benefit, to speak to the victim about what is it you want from us, the police. Because there is this idea that all we're looking for is prosecution. Sometimes that isn't possible because you don't know the perpetrator or there isn't the actual evidence. But sometimes, and in the vast majority of the cases we looked at, that is not what the victim wants. The victim wants it to stop. They want the police to go and have a word if they can, or they want the police to put out some messages. So what we can see here in the quotes is it enables the police to have these more informal approaches where the victim wants that. Most people wanted the police to go and speak and say, if you continue to do this, by the way, it could be perceived as a hate crime and we will take action against you. And in a lot of cases, that did work. So who benefits from RA? The police could see them because it shows the rationale. They are less likely to miss anything significant, of course, for the victim and for themselves in terms of the reputation of the force. It helps to identify the vulnerable, so it helps the police to get it right. And it helps to safeguard victims because you're not only asking them about what's happened, but you're saying, what is it you need to feel safe? You know, what can we do for you? A lot of it is about follow-up as well, because you have to follow up with risk assessment because it's supervised. So you have to be able to follow up with the victim. And one of the biggest complaints is the police didn't follow up with me. They said they were going to do something, they didn't follow up. That's not just with hate crime, it's with crimes more generally. So it's like a checklist for that. We found it also increased victim satisfaction. So these quotes refer to somebody who's had a poor relationship with the police previously, and then had reported and they'd used the risk assessment the second time. And this person had quite a troubled relationship, troubled being the police term, in inverted commas, this relationship. But the victim felt the police had actually got to grips with it much better using the risk assessment, told them, I'm much happier with what you've done for me this time. Okay, So increased satisfaction. So final thoughts on this then. So initially when I started this risk assessment, there was a lot of resistance, more work for us to do. In actual fact, sadly, Nottinghamshire decided 27 questions was too many to ask. And when they had a change of police leadership, they decided actually we're going to shrink that down, like forgetting why we developed it in the first place. We know this is political, right? But Difford and Powys really wanted to get this right, and they decided, no, that's right. So, and I think over time, officers have come to see the benefit, not just for the victim, but for the force. So first of all, it's because you, 1 minute, okay. The risk assessment is good because it's, rather than the police putting it on the basic, on the crime record, you're asking it in depth. So you're getting a much fuller picture than the crime records. It helps us to keep people safe, okay, to avoid worst case scenarios. Obviously, that's what they're for. And it also shows that we, as the police, are taking hate crime seriously. And I think that is fundamentally what we're talking about, because we see so many policies about taking it seriously, but it's a tool that means you have to be more thorough. You have to be. So if you're using it in the right spirit, that's what it should do. That's it. I think that was just about
Thank you, Professor Loretta Trickett, for opening up this afternoon session and for sticking to time. Very, very well timed. We've then got Dr. Megan McElhone. Sorry, I asked you right before we started and it completely went out of my mind. All right, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to come within about 10 seconds, I think, of the timer, but I'll do mine as well. So,
yeah.
Are you happy to use that?
Yeah, that'll be fine. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Today, my contribution is going to centre around Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hate and its co-constitution with essentialist accounts of working class racism in Britain specifically. So my work today has largely concerned police and state racism against racialised communities, and that's a topic of study that I came to owing to my own personal lived and multi-generational experiences of police power, racism, place, which is to say that in my native Australia, I'm part of a very large diasporic Lebanese and Palestinian community. You might be wondering why on earth I would be here today taking a British case study, and that is an entirely reasonable thing to ask. But between the beginning of 2020 and the end of 2024, I lived in London, and I was very fortunate to work at Birkbeck and to be surrounded by world-class anti-racist and feminist scholars. And that was, I don't need to tell anyone, a hell of a period in terms of British politics, from the reverberations of Brexit to COVID and BLM to Kill the Bill, and to last year's general election, which saw Reform UK take a number of seats, as well as those that they picked up in recent by-elections as well. And of course, as happens periodically, we saw riots here in the summer of last year, which were promoted by prominent far-right activists and shared an intimate relationship with anti-immigrant rhetoric, and included attacks on mosques and hotels, which were housing asylum seekers. When trying to think that through at the time, I'd only recently wrapped up my spring term module, which I used to teach at Birkbeck, which was called Race, Crime and Justice. And in the penultimate week of that module, we took hate crime as our topic of study, both because it's a prominent means by which the state has responded to campaigns and resistance instigated by racially minoritised communities, but also because BLM and last year's riots, amongst other examples, call into question the thinking that hate crime laws have been sufficient for protecting members of racialised communities from structural and systemic racisms. So to try and make sense of why that's the case and what's to be done about it, I'm taking more than a few cues from an excellent chapter titled The Politics of Hate by Tina Patel and David Tyra, which was published in 2011 as part of their book, Race, Crime and Resistance. And I'd prescribed that chapter to my Race, Crime and Justice students for reading and in Race, Crime and Justice. And so it was really fresh in my mind when I first spoke to Rachel about the potential for this event happening. And of course, it's occurred. And here we are. So the Patel and Tyra chapter that I've referred to aims to address what the authors perceived at the time, 2011 again, to be two lacuna in the discussions of race hate. Firstly, the tendency to consider hate in terms which rendered it void of effective content, And secondly, the absence of a conception of the political in mainstream criminological theorising of hate crime. And so what I want to do here is return to those insights, see whether they still hold, and what the effects are then for theorising the nature of hate in the perpetration of racism. And as I say, these are formative ideas. They've been tested with students with some rigour, but this is very much a work in progress, so please receive it as such. My central motivation is to make more of a conceptual contribution regarding hate, affect, state practice, and British politics. But I'm not a scholar of hate crime, as will become clear. I'm a scholar of race and policing. So I do apologise if there's nothing in the framework particularly original for hate crime scholars in attendance. And if that's the case, hopefully there's something in the case study that you find compelling. For the sake of coherence, I'm going to give a brief overview of the key claims made in the chapter that I've referred to before trying to apply them. So in that chapter, Patel and Tyra express concerns about the wholesale adoption of state-centric definitions of hate, especially those developed through legislation and official practice, including that of the CPS and the police. And of course, official actors might sometimes leave hate undefined, conflate it purely with hate crime, or perhaps use it synonymously with hostility and prejudice. And that might be a good thing in allowing for some positive exercises in discretion. Like most social phenomena, the face of racism and racist expression have changed somewhat in the decades since the Patel and Tyra piece was published, and they'll do so again in the next decade. So there's a reasonable argument against being too prescriptive. But the reason that we ought not to simply leave the power to define or not define hate in the hands of official actors is that state interests can converge with expressions of hate to reinforce the racial order and status quo. Not least in a colonially configured imperial power come nation, which was once so vast the sun never set on it, and which has been argued quite convincingly to have been sustained today through not just the tax and trade systems, but things like significant arms dealing and so on. So while it's widely recognised that race is a social construct, it never hurts to further add that it is first and foremost a Euro-colonial construct. And there is an inextricable link here between the social and histories of imperialism and colonialism. And so following renowned scholars of hate crime, including Barbara Perry, Patel and Tyra argue that we have to remain attentive to identities, as not being static or essential, fixed or immutable, but as relational and constituted and contested through political and social processes and practices. In addition to that, Patel and Tyra also add that we have to pay greater attention to the affective dimensions of racism. In their words, racism is steeped in the lingua franca of affect and emotion. Islamophobia provides a direct example of this. Phobia as a suffix. It does what it says on the tin. To some extent, official institutions make reference to the affective. There's no doubt about that, particularly through their recognition of hate crimes involving hostility, for example. But we also need to avoid the temptation to individualise and to place hatred on the margins of society and in the hearts, minds and actions of individual recalcitrants. One way that we might do that is to acknowledge, and there's a lot of people room that would do a much better job of this than me, but to acknowledge that in contemporary Britain, as in most of the English-speaking world, hate is increasingly stoked by prominent far-right actors. But following Patel and Tyra, we'll be well served by considering the extent to which establishment actors and official policy can over-determine racial difference into hatred and hatred into fear, creating a structuring context in which far-right actors flourish, but in which others also receive legitimacy, for example, in the case of Reform UK, and in which interpersonal displays of racism and hate are not altogether surprising, even if they are construed as deviant. And here we can approach the discursive or discourses as not just words, but organised state practices too, if we're going to follow the Foucauldian. There are some examples here on the slide, which relate to specifically, but not exclusively, Islamophobia in Britain, obviously, the of a global war on terror post 9/11, the British specific effects of 7/7, official discourse questioning multiculturalism, the production of suspect communities through domestic policing targeting alleged incipient Islamist terrorist threats, Prevent, and CSC. And as Patel Tara points out, if we're to follow the Foucauldian conception of things, we can also emphasise that the production of anxiety and awareness likely also increase surveillance and disperse surveillance and governance, linking the state, state institutions and subjects in governance projects. For example, in last summer's riots, Islamophobic sentiment and actions weren't simply a matter of individual bigots acting in an irrational manner. Those people that gathered on the street were often clear that they were doing so in defence of the nation, in defence of children, and defence of borders, all of which are constituted of racial order. That is how you maintain a racial order. And while it's fantastic to see how many people came out to argue the opposite and to defend British Muslims, refugees, and asylum seekers, it remains the case that the perpetration of racism and hate aren't just on the margins, and they aren't only stoked by far-right actors. Official state policy and practice give them credence too, as do the words and actions of officials. In other words, the state is not removed from the wider social relations which produce hate crime, and this absolutely has to be figured into conceptions of hate crime perpetration. And what's particularly interesting about thinking about race hate in terms of a governance project is the extent to which social actors who themselves experience marginality can be mobilised to enact forms of hate which still converge with the interests of the state. Last year's riots were largely pegged on the white working classes and especially white working class men in northern cities and towns. And this happened in the throes of the worst cost of living crisis in a generation and in the aftermath and afterlife of austerity, both of which have ultimately been born of and are consistent with capitalist profiteering and exploitation and efforts to protect concentrations of elite wealth and power. Put more bluntly, why would the working classes, who have been shunted by successive governments in this country, seek to defend the state and its interests? I think when we frame the interests of the state more in terms of neoliberal capitalism, it starts to make a bit more sense. Basically, under neoliberal capitalism, hate isn't just hostility or dislike, it's stoked antagonism. The work of far-right actors like Tommy Robinson to bind together the disenfranchised have been accounted for by others, and again, there are people in the room that do a much better job of that than me. What I'm more interested in here is how the political and social elite might at once maintain social disadvantage and disenfranchisement amongst the white working classes through neoliberalism and austerity, as well as state racism against racialised groups, migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, and yet maintain that hegemonic racial order by redirecting and over-determining working class people's grievances with structural disadvantages and state neglect into resentment of racialised groups, migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, who are implied or at times expressly stated to, of course, shortages in housing, food, jobs, etc. In that climate, hate crime laws can't fully equip with, they're not fully equipped to deal with the nature and origins of hate because they treat hate primarily as an interpersonal relation. But they might also be critiqued as a concession from the neoliberal state, which on the face of it looks like progress in keeping people safe, but in fact also works to maintain the facade of a liberal state at the centre, which is not tainted by white supremacy. And this is very neoliberal because it moralises and it individualises in its logic. It obscures social structures and social disadvantage. And it also obscures state practice apart from retaining a role from the state in administering punishment. And it's also the basis of classic divide and conquer stuff, it would seem. So while we wouldn't want to leave actors like Tommy Robinson unaccounted for, in these structuring conditions, what is perhaps more concerning is the increasing incorporation or platforming and palatability of racism much closer to state power through actors like Nigel Farage. Given the extent to which I've already yabbered on, I can't go into this in too much detail, but it did seem remiss of me to introduce a framework and not really apply it. So what does this framework do for our understandings of what happened last summer? Well, if we're going to account for the effective and the somewhat irrationality of race hate, then that is helpful in accounting for the speed and believability of tropish claims that a 17-year-old charged with the Southport attacks was a Muslim asylum seeker who just arrived in the UK by boat the previous year, and the circulation of those and the way in which they very quickly acted as an animus for the riots. On the face of it, we saw a really positive and responsive mobilisation by the police and courts, who effected a huge number of arrests and charges, including for racially aggravated criminal damage and for convictions for online activity relating to the riots. But the riots were largely spontaneous. So the extent to which these sorts of charges will affect deterrence in the future, if something like this is to happen again, remains to be seen, I suppose. But prison sentences will certainly deepen the disadvantage that many of the rioters were already facing, and will lay more fertile ground for the divide and conquer type politics that we've already seen. At the same time, the Prime Minister, in his infinite wisdom, announced the creation of a national violent disorder program, amongst which would see the broader spread of facial recognition technology, which again is known to exacerbate existing racial inequalities in policing and surveillance. And further to that, the Home Secretary thought it would be very clever as well to pledge to deport 14,500 illegal immigrants in the coming 6 months, otherwise curb migration and expand detention centres. And this is precisely why we need to look to the centre to best account for the structure and conditions in which hate thrives and functions as a political relation and a power structure, and not just the matter of white working class recalcitrants. Thank you.
Dr. Daisy Matthews and Dr. Larissa's presentation.
Yes, or that one if you like. Okay, just go up and down on the arrows. I know it is, it's really old school. Okay, hi everyone, I'm Larissa Sandy. My pronouns are she, they. Daisy, she, her. Okay. I want to start our paper today with an acknowledgement of country. I first began doing some of this research on the Wurundjeri land in Nam in the Kulin Nation. And today I'm going to be discussing some events that happened on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I want to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of that land on some of this work was carried out. So in our paper, we want to explore how client criminalisation, that's the Swedish model or the Nordic model, depending on your language, works to create a hateful context. We want to show how at a fundamental level, this actually encourages the creation of hostile societies and that are hostile to sex work. And we also want to show how policy contexts can both cause, enact, and then constitute this harm. We should say that neither of us hate crime scholars, nor are we policing scholars. We're kind of coming into policing, but very much gender and sex work scholars as well. So this might be a little bit different as well. So what we want to do is we want to start this exploration with Swedish research. This research came from the late 90s, and it culminated in the development of the first model we had for exiting sex work. What we see on the slide here on the quote is how this model conceptualized sex work was lived and experienced as purely harmful. I'm not going to read that out. You can read it for yourself. I hope you got to the last sentence, because in it, I think you can see some rather remarkable comparisons between sex workers and Holocaust survivors. Everyone had the chance to read that? Yeah. I first became aware of the Swedish model through an event at my old university in Australia. This event was billed as the first ever abolitionist conference in my country. And in an interview about the conference, the organiser and editor of a book called Prostitution Narratives, which was also launched at this conference. So the editor, Caroline Norma, stated, and you can see it up on the slide there, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the idea of this conference was to be supporting sex trade survivors in how we can help support them, right, in the best way. But this conference was met with resistance from local sex workers. So the local sex worker organisation, the Vixen Collective, was organising in-person and online protests. They also worked with advocates at the university, like myself. We petitioned the Chancellor about how the conference and the organisers were silencing sex workers' voices, and how the aims of this conference to abolish the sex industry was affecting some of our students as well, who were sex working students. Some sex workers that were taking part in the social media action faced abuse in the form of messages of hate and very offensive and extremist language from these conference attendees. The conference organisers, however, dismissed the protests. They labelled the Vixen Collective as a sex trade group or pro-prostitution advocacy organisation, and Norma claimed the following, you can see up on the slide there. And what's more important here is also this point where she's saying we don't care one bit about these prostitution buyers. Hold that in your mind. We'll talk about that a bit later. But what we can see here is some very common narrative devices that are used by abolitionist feminists, some of whom, like Norma, are also gender critical feminists as well. And we can see a creation of a hostility towards sex work. And as I said, recall that claim there, we don't care one bit about prostitution buyers. So let's look a little bit at the Swedish model and how we think it creates a society hostile to sex work.
So the Swedish model is a three-pronged legislative model. So what this intends to do is criminalise the buyers of sex. So removes the existing laws that penalise or criminalise sex workers themselves and instead focuses on the buyers. So what this model does then is that it decriminalises the selling of sexual services while simultaneously criminalises the purchasing of it. And what it also does or intends to do is re-educate the police and judiciary systems around sex work and sexual commerce. So fundamental to this re-education is the promotion of sex work as a form of violence against women, and an explicit focus on the harms of sex work, which are constructed here as a form of human rights violations, and so the ultimate aim is abolition. So key to this legislative model is the reframing of sex work as a form of violence, and one of the ways in which this is achieved is through creating this framework for understanding and viewing people essentially as rapists, and sex workers are then, as a result, rape victims. And so therefore that sex work and the sex industry is violating gender equality.
Okay. So the Swedish model itself has some very problematic elements, and some of the language used by proponents really pathologizes sex work and sex workers. So on the slide, you can see how women's involvement in sex work is framed in exclusively negative terms. And again, I won't read that, I'll let that there for you to read. But what we see is really common in this is a one-dimensional view of sex workers as victims. Sex working women are seen as damaged, and that then supports the conclusion that sex work, as damaging and harmful, is something that women need to escape. Hence that need for rescue and redemption that comes in a lot of these frameworks and approaches. I want to say our use of women and gendered language here is quite deliberate. This is understood as a gendered issue, which means that leaves out a lot of other different types of sex work as well. And so this framing of sex work as a form of violence against women is quite problematic. We're also arguing this because it relies on these essentialist ideas and notions of gender and narratives about sex work that involve dominant men and submissive women. And it reinforces the idea that violence against sex workers is inevitable. This study that we've been citing from and exploring here was really influential in the Swedish Parliament, passing legislation that criminalised buying sexual services. So that's the origin of the Nordic model. What we can see and what's evident from some of this work is how a woman's identity was fixed as the prostitute victim. And it's a framing in which we also see sex workers being responsibilised to exit sex work.
So further proponents of the Swedish model, like Caroline Norma says, is that paid sex is a form of hush money that works to circumvent rape laws, and by implication, this constructs clients as rapists. This portrayal of paid sex as an act of rape becomes central to this criminalisation of clients, who are then seen here as exclusively heterosexual males, cis males, and the othering of this group. So this further compounds their stigmatisation and marginalisation. This linking of sex work and rape is evident in an extract from Melissa Farley, which you can see on the slides. So Radford argues that this male learned sex buying behaviour and women's marginalisation are the key drivers for sex work. And to address this issue and tackle the learned sex buying behaviours, rehabilitation programmes are offered as one way of addressing these. So this is seen, clients that are arrested are offered the opportunity to attend what's called John schools. And this re-education programme intends to shame clients on the harm that they do, and reflected here on a John school in the UK in Hull. So I'll just give you a second to read that. Everyone read it? Yeah,
All right. Now, what we've got working in tandem with these constructions is the demonisation of sex workers and their supporters as part of this pimp lobby. So this pimp lobby is another construction that is tied to negative portrayals of sex work we see within this model. And it's essentially a grouping comprised of what we can say is subjects without value, drawing from Beverly Skeggs's work. And it's people, individuals and groups who are presenting contrary arguments, perspectives and evidence, so sex workers and their supporters. And we can see, this pimp lobby is put forward as this powerful by, people within the proponents of the Nordic model as being this powerful protected industry that are operating with impunity. But what it is also drawing on is a very common metaphor that we see in discourses of sex work, and that's the idea of this criminal underworld. And the pimp lobby then conjures up ideas and images about organised crime and illicit activities. So pimps forming a really powerful lobby group is particularly alarming and alarmist. And it works to create this sense of panic and urgency, as the term itself is really highly emotive. So we're looking at the popular imagination here and how they might connect in with this idea of a pimp lobby as well. Pimp conjures up these images of really highly abusive men who exert brutal force and violence to try and control women. They're seen as being morally bankrupt. They're making money from women's sexual exploitation, and sometimes in a way to exert control over women, they will get them addicted to drugs to create this docile, obedient subject. So individuals or groups who challenge the idea of sex work as violence against women or attempt to present alternative views about sex work are then said to be under control, under the sway of this very powerful lobby group. By implication, they shouldn't be listened to because they're being controlled and they're being manipulated by pimps and are in their pockets. And as we saw from the beginning of this paper in the conference at my old university, we saw how it was a strategy that was used to silence sex workers' voices.
So framing sex work as just purely harm actually makes it very, very difficult for sex workers to speak about the harms that they do face. And it also, downplays the research which shows that the illegal, visible and stigmatised status of sex work is something that attracts violence. The only legitimate subject position offered to sex workers under the Swedish model is that of victims. As rape victims, the state and public services see sex workers as a population deserving of assistance. But this assistance is only offered when they dob in their clients and leave the industry, so exit the industry. And I'm quoting Caroline Norma here. This also becomes the only subject position available to sex workers through which societies can view them as sympathetically and as deserving subjects. Sex workers then are divided into two key groups, the morally good and the bad, and this is drawing upon Beverly Skegg's work here. Sex workers are cast as part of the pimp lobby, as Larissa said, under the sway of manipulative men and don't know their own minds or the truth around sex work. Clients are also demonised and they're vilified as rapists, and societies are re-educated about the harms of sex work. All of this works to create a society hostile to sex work. The society opens up workers to significant harm, stigma and discrimination. We've highlighted how this approach does not have the principles of tolerance, equal rights or safety at its core, and this has shown how policy context can cause and enact and indeed constitute harm. Thank you. Thank you.
Perfect on time again.
Cheers.
Thank you both. And we now have the final paper of the afternoon, which is going to be online by Tiana, Gaudette and Assistant Professor Ryan Scrivens from Michigan State.
I think it would be just Ryan. It's a joint paper, but I think Tiana will not be available, but Ryan is. Hi, Ryan. I think you are muted.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear really well.
Okay,
Can you
perfect.
share your slides?
Yeah, I'm working on it right now. Log out and come back in. I apologize. Do you mind giving me just a quick second?
Yeah, absolutely, Ryan. Not a problem.
Thank you.
We just give Ryan a few seconds, minutes. We'll see how long it takes. Okay, Ryan is back.
Hello. Yeah, it's all right.
Can you try your slides? Otherwise, Ryan, I can share them. I have a copy.
Yeah, I'm trying right now. Just Chrome's giving me a hard time right now. Apologies for this. I'll give it one more try, and if we need to share, then I can just go. It's fine. I can just present without sharing the slides if that's the case as well. I'm comfortable with that if that needs to be the case.
If you want to try one more, and then if it doesn't work, I can share your slides. Rachel, do you think it's a case of access that we can't? It's not that, no. We can't see your slides, Ryan. Shall I share your slides?
Can you see the sharing now?
Yes, yeah.
Perfect. Ready to roll?
Perfect. I think you're sharing your screen, which is fine. But we're not seeing the slides yet. So
Okay.
yeah.
I'm okay just presenting without slides as well. I can just go like this because it's going to be a bit of a gong show trying to share going slide to slide. Is that okay?
So shall I share then? Or?
Yeah, you don't need to share. I mean, if you want, you can just put the cover of my slides, and I'll just
talk about talk rather than use slides.
yeah, exactly. I'm ready when you are.
I'm a bit slow, so I needed like a few seconds. I actually have a learning difficulty, so it's yeah. So yeah, the floor is yours, Ryan.
Okay. Thanks very much, and thank you everybody for coming today. Sounds like a lot of really interesting discussions being had today, and I'm certainly glad to be part of them. The talk I'm giving is titled Pathways Out of Hate Groups, Trends in the Empirical Literature and Future Directions. Unfortunately, Tiana couldn't be here today, so I'm going to be presenting on our behalf. Just as a little bit of a general background. So among the most pressing issues facing those in the field of criminal justice is the rise of hate-motivated violence and instances. Just as one example, according to the most recent reports from the FBI on their hate crime statistics released most recently, is they saw a 12% increase from 2021 to 2023. And as we all know in this room, or should, that's a wild underestimation of the scale and scope of the problem. But to shed light on the factors that contribute to the rise in hate-motivated violence and hate groups in particular, a large proportion of the research has focused on why individuals get involved in extremist hate, in particular extremist hate groups. Yet relatively little attention has been paid to the motivations for leaving these groups, in part because of the challenges associated with gaining access to folks in these groups, paired with the difficulty of defining and measuring levels of success in leaving, amongst many other things. It has only been in the last decade that researchers, practitioners, and policymakers have begun to turn their attention to how, why, and when individuals leave extremist hate groups. Notably, much of the empirical research in this regard has incorporated the perspective of former extremists, as they have firsthand experience with and knowledge into such pressing issues in hate and extremism study. So for this presentation, I'm going to explore the empirical research that draws from the insights of former extremists to understand pathways out of hate groups in particular. In so doing, I will first define some key concepts oftentimes thrown around within the discussions of leaving hate groups. I will then synthesize the empirical literature on pathways out of hate groups, and then I will conclude with offering suggestions for progressing research in this regard. Two terms that oftentimes come up during discussions of leaving hate groups are de-radicalization and disengagement. So de-radicalization is the process by which an individual is diverted from extremist ideology, eventually rejecting an extremist ideology, and in turn moderating their beliefs. So it's this idea around ideology. Disengagement is more of the action. So it's the process by which an individual decides to leave their associated extremist group or movement to reintegrate back into society. So some of you are probably wondering, okay, so what's a former extremist then? Researchers generally agree that former extremists are individuals who at one time in their lives subscribed to and or perpetuated violence in the name of a particular extremist ideology and have since publicly and or privately denounced violence in the name of that particular extremist ideology. So getting those out of the way, what does the empirical literature tell us? First, it's important to provide a little bit of a background on how formers have been involved, I guess, in this space. They played an increasingly important role in informing empirical research on hate and extremism related issues. So over the past 15 plus years, it's become more common for researchers, practitioners, and policymakers in the Western world to draw from the perspectives of formers, primarily to generate knowledge on and respond to the prevalence and contours of extremist hate groups and movements. Here, formers have been involved in a variety of roles, ranging from consulting to peer mentoring, to interventionists, to peacemakers, to participating in research. In this regard, some have raised serious concerns about formers working in the space, ranging from questions about their credibility, and then questions about whether their inclusion in this space would raise red flags in the public sphere. Others have argued that formers can provide valuable, pragmatic insight into key issues faced by hate and extremism scholars. It should come as a little surprise that researchers have drawn from the perspectives of formers to better understand key questions, primarily surrounding the process of joining extremist groups or movements, the process of leaving extremist groups or movements, both pathways in and out, experiences of women in hate groups, the role of the internet in facilitating violent extremism, hate groups, as well as combating violent extremism, whether it's preventing or countering it. But for empirical studies that have interviewed formers about their pathways out of hate groups, they tend to focus on processes of disengagement or de-radicalization, but not specifically on the interactions between disengagement or de-radicalization. Disengagement research in this regard has generally highlighted the various complex pathways out of violent extremism or leaving extremist groups that were linked to exhaustion of hating, disillusionment, aging out, and identity reformation. De-radicalization research has found that family support and a shift in social identity play important roles in an individual's process out of de-radicalization. This is really informative. Focusing on disengagement or de-radicalization in isolation from one another is an important oversight because it assumes that both processes function or operate in a vacuum. In response, researchers in recent years have urged others to examine processes of disengagement and de-radicalization and how they interact to develop a more comprehensive understanding of the complexities associated with leaving hate groups. So we've published several pieces in this space, conducting a search using dedicated academic research databases. We found just nine studies that interviewed or drew from the accounts of formers with an emphasis on the relationship between processes of disengagement and de-radicalization. Some may think 9 studies is quite a few. This is a pretty active moving space, so it's relatively not very many. I'm going to synthesize this research. The first is the work by Volt and Simi, who in 2015 conducted life history interviews with US former right-wing extremists. And what they found is that the process of disengagement and de-radicalization were multifaceted and influenced by a variety of factors. This included, but was certainly not limited to, what they described as a self-reflection process, which stemmed from hitting rock bottom and or contact with law enforcement and subsequent interaction. And this is where participants who Simi and Volt interviewed developed a growing awareness of and critical perspective on the ideologies driving hate groups that they were part of. Brown and colleagues from RAND in 2021 interviewed US former right-wing extremists, their families and friends, and similarly found a wide variety of journeys out of hate groups, but with the most common factor being disillusionment and burnout, i.e. the feelings of disappointment by the hypocrisy and negative behaviors in a hate group. And researchers similarly suggested that leaning on family and friends outside of hate groups for support is helpful especially during the early stages of the disengagement process. And research also suggests that the restructuring identities grounded in positive and meaningful activities and influences is helpful when people are leaving, i.e. what some refer to as a proactive self-development. Horgan and colleagues in 2017 conducted an in-depth interview with a US former right-wing extremist, and they similarly found that multiple push and pull interactions shape disengagement and de-radicalization decisions, including time in prison to provide that physical separation from hate groups or movements to self-reflect, as well as adopting new social roles and a sense of identity beyond the hate group or movement. Altier and colleagues in 2017 drew from autobiographical accounts to examine disengagement, and what they found was that certain push factors, i.e. disillusionment with the movement and burnout, were more likely to drive disengagement decisions than actual de-radicalization. So importantly here, the authors further point out that while de-radicalization may be an important factor for why some leave hate groups, it's not the most prevalent cause nor a prerequisite for leaving. Rather, disillusionment with the movement and burnout were more likely to drive disengagement decisions than de-radicalization. Interestingly, Pete Simi and colleagues examined the challenges associated with leaving right-wing extremists via life course interviews with formers, and they found that individuals experienced similar residual effects that were described as a form of addiction. These residual efforts or effects were found to intrude on cognitive processes, as well as involve long-term effects on emotional and physiological levels, and in some cases involve complete relapse into extremist behavior. Gaudette, myself, and others, we interviewed Canadian former right-wing extremists on their pathways out of violent extremism, amongst many other things. And we similarly found that not only were the processes of disengagement and de-radicalization multifaceted and multidimensional in nature, but extremist beliefs also tended to persist beyond disengagement from violent extremism. So together, this empirical research conceptualizes leaving hate groups as a process impacted by several key events, not really a single moment. So various complex factors influence decisions to leave, much of which is facilitated, at least in part, through self-reflection after hitting rock bottom. And through this self-reflection, expectations associated with being part of a group, these beliefs that they're part of a family, a loyal family that's united, are less genuine than they expect, which is certainly influential in their process of leaving. And lastly, this combination of burnout, encouragement from spouses or significant others to leave, and positive individuals outside of the movement influences their decision to leave. So having said all of this, where do we go from here? Well, one way is to continue to progress the research. So despite the studies that I've just highlighted on how individuals leave hate groups, several important research questions have yet to be explored in depth. Questions that may inform policy and aid practitioners in combating hate and extremist violence. The first is this idea of around roles and leading. So little attention has been paid to how individuals' organizational roles influences their decision to disengage. In response, LTA and colleagues examined autobiographies and interviews with former nationalists, former right-wing extremists, and former Islamists from the US, Canada, and UK to examine how their roles influence their probability of or reasoning for leaving. What the authors found was that specific roles, i.e. leadership and violent roles, resulted in fewer alternatives for making exit likely. And on the other hand, they also found that both conflict roles, whether it's discrepancy between ability and assigned roles, and role strain, conflicting roles with or outside of a group, as well as these supportive roles, were more likely to disengage. The authors also uncovered that there was an association between certain roles and the experience of different push-pull factors for disengagement. For example, the violent operators were more likely to experience burnout and physiological distress, which may have essentially pushed them out of the movement. So the implications from this is that more nuanced understanding of the association between group roles and disengagement is needed to inform policy for responding to extremist hate, especially interventions tailored to individual motivations and circumstances. The second area that we should be thinking about in moving the research space ahead is around these lingering views and relapse. So research on the general difficulties of leaving hate groups and the extent to which lingering extremist views influence relapse into extremist behavior is underdeveloped, but some work does exist. So Bubolt and Simi relied on life history interviews with former US right-wing extremists, and they identified numerous difficulties associated with disengagement, such as negative emotionality, i.e. guilt, ideological relapse, and maintaining social ties with current extremist members. Gaudette, myself, and others interviewed former Canadian right-wing extremists, and we similarly highlight the challenges of leaving extremism, wherein participants that we interviewed claimed that they disengaged from violent extremism, but most still maintain extremist views. Comparably, Simi and colleagues in 2017 examined challenges associated with disengagement via in-depth interviews. And like I mentioned before, which I think is fascinating, is the participants expressed experiencing several residual effects as they described as a form of addiction. And so the implications here is that researchers should examine differences between individual trajectories of disengagement involving substantial residual compared to those who do not have substantial residual, as well as situational dynamics related to specific episodes of residual and the neurocognitive qualities of identity residual, amongst other things. And lastly, thinking across movements. So more comparative research is needed to understand the process of disengagement across hate movements and ideological groups generally. And only really a small number of studies have started to address this question. Brown and colleagues interviewed US former right-wing extremists and Islamists to examine, amongst other things, pathways out of violent extremism, and they found disillusionment and burnout were the most cited reasons for leaving. Windisch interviewed former left-wing extremists and former right-wing extremists to compare disengagement processes and found important similarities and important differences. In terms of similarities, Windisch found that both groups discussed feelings of distrust that stem from a lack of integrity and benevolence amongst leaders and fellows. But interestingly, the difference is that while left-wing extremists discussed distrust stemming from a lack of support following victimization from external entities, right-wing extremists discussed internal entities, particularly violence between members, as contributing to perceptions of distrust. And so the implications here are that organizational dynamics of each group are indeed different, which in turn impact disengagement processes. Therefore, more cross-case comparisons are needed between different ideological groups to expand empirical observations and strengthen theoretical conclusions regarding disengagement processes. So to wrap it all up, this presentation has shed some light on the value of insights of former extremists in terms of processes out of hate groups. And while we've discussed key trends in this evolving space, much of this work remains in its infancy and requires further investigation. And our hope is that this presentation has sparked interest amongst those working in this field to consider including formers in the research design, because doing so may provide them with a unique insider perspective into an array of pressing issues in hate studies and others that may not be addressed without the insights of formers. Thank you.
I'd stop